When I first saw that the FPS first-person shooter documentary was being made, I didn't think it was something we needed. The early days of 90s shooters are well trod at this point, and many of the best anecdotes have been told over and over again. So when one of the documentary's writers reached out to me, I was honored, but dubious. Would this really be worth my time? Well, over 4.5 hours later, and I have to say I was worried without reason. What's old is new again. The documentary starts off with a fantastic opening sequence where classic game characters walk through the game's credits and blow up each name to make the scene change to the next name, all while done to some bumpin' tunes. Interestingly, despite the fact that writers are credited, there's no classic narrator telling us an overarching story about the subject matter and linking the games together. This may throw some people off, and it does make the thesis of FPS a little hard to suss out, especially towards the back end, as the organization gets really weird. In the place of such narration is a crash zoom into a game's box art, and then the interviewees are the ones telling us the story by way of careful editing. And this works for the most part because the interview questions were clearly top-notch in guiding the answers, and it's clear that the people being interviewed have a lot of passion for the work and are just stoked to be able to chat about it yet again. The documentary rightfully starts the history of FPS games with 1973's Maze, later Maze War in 1974 once they added multiplayer. I'm a little surprised though that there's no mention of Space Sim, the 1974 spaceflight shooter by Jim Bowery and Frank Gonzalino, which is often given special notice as one of the first-person shooters as well. Not to mention it had tremendous influence on games like Elite Dangerous, and then to a large extent eventually No Man's Sky and Star Citizen. And before we get into the obvious stuff from id Software in the 90s, this documentary actually really did me a solid by introducing me to the Apple II's obscure but important 1988 game Colony by David Allen Smith, a very close to 3D and mouse look type of game that had its share of shooting but whose real accomplishment was its focus on environmental storytelling and simulation within a space station. It's highly possible this is the closest thing that we ever had to an immersive sim until dynamic problem solving started showing up in the Wasteland and Ultima series in the late 1980s and early 1990s. After Colony, the doc then shifts to the id Software boys, of whom I could listen to and have for hours. It's also nice to see Romero not just effusive as ever, but really giving us some cool technical details about level and encounter design, which is not something he breaks out into nearly as much as the other id guys do. After that, we briefly detour to Ultima Underworld and War Inspector before running into System Shock, which is really taken care of interview-wise, including some really cool anecdotes about how players would bounce grenades off walls into nearby rooms to kill enemies ahead of schedule, something they didn't technically know would work based on just the way games were back in the day, since few games had ever rendered or made AI responsive to stimuli if it couldn't be directly seen by the player, a la the way raycasting often works. What's great about the format of these types of interviews is also who they choose to weigh in. You get the greats like Romero and Carmack and people like GoldenEye's Hilton or Jones, but also some insightful, if not just fun, commentary from more unique voices, like PC Gamer editor Evan Lottie, and even my homeboy G-Man Lives, as he simps for old predictable standbys like Doom and Duke Nukem, but also Chad-level inserts about Blood, Quake 2, Fear Shotgun as Best Shotgun.
Best Shotgun, and this is not up for debate, is Fear Shotgun. There's anyone who argues it's just incorrect.
And even some theories about Half-Life's G-Man from the G-Man himself. It's G-Manception! Now, one more quick aside about G-Man Lives. I saw a tweet of his the other day talking about how seeing himself being interviewed alongside the greats was like someone interviewing Jordan and Pippen and then asking the hot dog guy what he thought of basketball. Now, we all know what he means by this self-deprecating statement, but I do think he undersells a little bit how formative someone like him can be and is. Half of my Steam library is something I first saw him recommend, as he was the first retro reviewer I came across, and he introduced me to countless other games like Thief, Deus Ex, Catacomb 3D, Blood, No One Lives Forever, Redneck Rampage, Soldier of Fortune, Blake Stone, Kingpin, and so many more. Creators and preservationists alike, never underestimate your value. Never underestimate the seed of joy that can grow in another person's life if you just get out there and share your passion authentically enough to convince them to try something new. I mean, I was fed up with new games and paralyzed as to which of the countless games I already owned that I should dive back into. You know, they're all so good, but so involved. And then G-Man Lives and others guided me towards the joy of a simpler time where teams worked tirelessly within their limits, slept under their desks, and to make milestones happen for the very first time in their respective genres. To a large extent, a lot of us are still standing atop the shoulders of these giants, and it really is an intangible but invaluable aspect of my life that the countless hours I spent lapping up retro games, especially shooters, has opened my eyes wide to games that my modern sensibilities would shrug off as too ugly, too clunky, or too complicated to even try, much less get all the way through and eventually love. There's just nothing like the good old days, and we need them now more than ever as we slide further into Battle Royale or open world with shitty RPG mechanics territory for nearly every major franchise. Well, diatribes aside, if G-Man Live's inclusion in this documentary wasn't cool enough, you've got a murderous row of other, interesting people to hear from, like Cooked Until He's Golden Brown Cliff Bleszinski, sounding like he's pleasantly surprised by every observation he makes. Cringy, but at least he made Doom 3 Tim Willett, saying vague sound bites that almost anyone generally familiar with FPS history could say.
Probably not the best business decision.
And we even get to hear Randy Pitchford say Diablo as Diablo.
What makes NetHack fun, or Diablo. What makes Diablo fun is becoming more powerful.
And nearly come to tears talking about how Tiny Tina is just so real, y'all.
Tina is always her true self.
What a guy. So the vibe and the information is great fun, but I do want to touch on the organization of the documentary. For the most part, the first 2.5 to 3 hours or so are just chronological history, and it all just makes sense in the way it pans out, right? But once it gets out of the most well-trod area of FPS history, the back hour or so gets a little disjointed. Now this may be the place where the classic narrator trope most documentaries have would weld these sections together better, because for some reason, we go over Halo all the way to its third entry, and then jump back into a section about how generally other lesser-known console shooters did, like Turok, Perfect Dark, and Time Splitters, and then we eventually make our way to Black, Prey 2006, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, and Bulletstorm. And then somehow we make our way to Half-Life 2 from 2004, and then Steam in general. The organization here just seems like it should have wrapped late 90s console shooters that were on the rise, and then naturally transition into, oh look, Halo really took it to the next level, and then progressed from there into these lesser-known ones that are also later on in the timeline. It feels like the parts of the documentary aren't noticing each other happening, and it's oftentimes redundant at a certain point and just clearly not organized in a way that every section naturally propels into the next one. I would also point out that some inclusions on this list of important FPS games seem entirely preferential, either because the doc's producers just want to include some of their favorites, or simply because they got some unexpectedly good anecdotes about obscure shooters in the interview process and decided to just smush them in there. Now there's nothing wrong with that, and I appreciate some obscure games getting their time in the sun, but there are a couple where you're kind of like, wait, this game felt important enough to the genre's development to include? Alright. Although, on the other hand, I love that the documentary seems unconcerned with public opinion about, what's cool and what's the most important, but I also have to wonder if that's sometimes why the organization seems a little bit arbitrary too. But that's all the criticism I really have. I appreciate the doc's over-it stance on Call of Duty and Battle Royale games, and their gratefulness that boomer shooters reignited the public interest in single-player FPS campaigns. There's just a boyish joy and freedom to these games, and I'm here for it. So in conclusion, I think this documentary will be the new gold standard for the baseline information about all of these games for the foreseeable future. It's, if nothing else, a great compendium of information, even if it doesn't have a particular thesis other than the fact that these games are sweet and you should play them. So fair enough. To be honest, in a world that's co-opted so much of entertainment recently to make grandstanding, disingenuous moral statements, I'm more than happy to just watch something that lives for the love of the game. So go ahead and spread the love. You can pre-order the documentary right now at the documentary's website, and there are all sorts of different varieties of the product that you can get, replete with merch and other crap. So go check it out. It may not be the most transformative, unique piece of media you'll ever consume on the topic, but it's good at what it says on the tin, and that is getting the big names together and making a clean, concise, and nostalgic trip through our favorites with some surprises along the way. And I can think of much worse ways to spend 3 to 4 hours, like watching one of those awful Avatar movies. Before I go, I got a shout out to my patrons Mark Neubauer, Shantiva, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, James Wyatt, and new patron whom a lot of you may recognize, The Nth Review. So thanks so much, y'all, and I can only reverence your generosity and use it as fuel to make the best stuff I can in the future. Till next time, peace!